When the fire alarm went off at Riverside Apartments at 3:42 a.m., most residents stumbled out in confusion, some still in pajamas, many forgetting basic safety protocols. But within minutes, one man had taken command of the chaos. Harold Martinez, the quiet retiree from 4B, was calmly directing evacuations, organizing headcounts, and coordinating with first responders like he'd done 1,000 times before, which it turned out he had. The fire started in Unit 3C when an overloaded electrical outlet sparked behind couch. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who lived alone, had been asleep when smoke began filling her apartment. Her screams woke the building, and within moments, the ancient fire alarm system was shrieking through the halls. Harold Martinez jolted awake instantly, his mind immediately alert despite the early hour. At 68, he still maintained the sharp reflexes that had served him well during 25 years of military service. But his neighbors didn't know about his background. To them, he was just the polite retiree who kept his small apartment neat and rarely made noise. As Harold stepped into the hallway, he was hit by the acrid smell of electrical fire and the sounds of panic. Doors were slamming open, people were shouting, and he could hear children crying from multiple directions. The building's narrow hallways were already filling with confused residents, some heading toward the main stairs, others uncertain which way to go. Harold's training kicked in automatically. "Everyone, listen to me," he called out in a voice that carried authority without shouting. "We need to evacuate in an orderly fashion. Families with children, stay together and move toward the south stairwell. Adults, help elderly residents on your floor before heading down." Most people were too panicked to question why this quiet neighbor was suddenly giving orders. They just followed his calm, confident directions. Harold quickly assessed the situation. The main north stairwell was already crowded and moving slowly. The south stairwell was clearer, but farther from some apartments. The building had 52 units across 4 floors, housing roughly 130 people, including children and elderly residents with mobility issues. "Mrs. Chun," he called to a young mother struggling with 2 small children and a baby carrier, "take the south stairs." "Mr. Rodriguez, can you help Mrs. Patterson from 3C? She's elderly and may need assistance." As people began moving in more organized groups, Harold positioned himself at the central hallway junction where he could see both stairwells and coordinate traffic flow. "No running on the stairs," he directed. "Steady pace, watch your footing. If you smell smoke, stay low. Cover your mouth and nose." 20-year-old Jake Thompson from 2A looked at Harold with confusion. "Dude, how do you know all this stuff?" "Experience," Harold replied simply, then turned to help guide a family with an infant toward the clearer exit route. What his neighbors didn't know was that Harold had spent 15 years as a master sergeant specializing in emergency operations and base security. He'd coordinated evacuations during natural disasters, managed crisis responses in combat zones, and trained countless soldiers in emergency protocols. Organizing the evacuation of one apartment building was routine compared to evacuating military bases under enemy fire. Harold realized they needed better organization outside the building. People were clustering near the entrance, exactly where emergency vehicles would need access. "Everyone, move to the parking lot," Harold called down the stairwell. "Stay away from the building entrance. Families, stay together and do a head count." Harold was the last person to reach the ground floor, having checked each floor for stragglers. Outside, he found exactly what he'd expected: clusters of confused, frightened people standing too close to the building. No one sure if everyone had made it out safely. "Attention everyone," Harold announced, his voice cutting through the worried chatter. "We need to organize by floor for accountability. Building residents only in the parking lot. Visitors and family members, please identify yourselves to your hosts." He quickly divided the crowd into 4 groups based on floor numbers and assigned responsible adults to conduct head counts for each floor. Within minutes, they had a clear picture: 3 people unaccounted for, including Mrs. Patterson from 3C where the fire had started. Just as Harold was considering whether to attempt a search himself, the first fire truck arrived, followed quickly by 2 more and an ambulance. Fire Captain Jennifer Walsh jumped out and immediately looked for whoever was in charge. "Who's the building manager?" she called out. "The manager isn't here," Harold responded, stepping forward. "I've been coordinating the evacuation. We have accountability for most residents, but 3 people are still unaccounted for, including an elderly woman from the unit where the fire started." Captain Walsh looked at Harold with surprise. In her 15 years responding to residential fires, she'd never arrived to find such an organized scene. Usually, residents were scattered, panicked, and had— "You organized all this?" she asked. "Basic emergency protocols," Harold replied. "Mrs. Patterson in 3C, Mr. Kim in 2F, and the Johnson family from 4D are unaccounted for. The fire appears to have started in 3C from an electrical issue." "How do you know it's electrical?" "Smell and smoke color when I was evacuating the 3rd floor," Harold answered matter-of-factly. Captain Walsh studied Harold's calm demeanor and precise information. "Sir, are you military or law enforcement?" "Retired military. Master Sergeant, 25 years. "That explains it," Captain Walsh said, then turned to her crew. "We have 3 units to check, 2F, 3C, and 4D. 3rd floor electrical fire. Evacuations complete and accounted for except for missing persons." As firefighters entered the building, Harold continued organizing the residents outside. He noticed that several people were elderly or had medical conditions, and the October night was cold. "Families with infants and elderly residents. We need to get you somewhere warm," Harold announced. "Mrs. Robinson, can you open the community center across the street? And we need someone to contact the Red Cross for emergency shelter assistance." Sarah Kim, a nurse who lived in 1B, approached Harold. "Mr. Martinez, my grandmother is diabetic and doesn't have her medication. Should I be worried?" "How long since her last dose?" Harold asked. "About 6 hours. She should be fine for a few more hours, but let's get her checked by the paramedics just to be safe." Harold guided Sarah toward the ambulance crew. "Any other medical concerns should be reported now while we have medical personnel on scene." All 3 missing residents. Mrs. Patterson had been overcome by smoke, but was conscious and breathing. Mr. Kim had simply slept through the alarm due to hearing aids being out, and the Johnson family had evacuated through a back exit and were safe in their car. As the immediate crisis passed, Harold found himself surrounded by neighbors who were seeing him in a completely new light. "Harold," said Tom Bradley from 3, "I had no idea you were military. You just saved this whole building from disaster." "We all saved the building," Harold corrected. "Everyone followed directions and helped their neighbors. That's what made the difference." "But you knew exactly what to do," added Maria Santos from 1D. "It was like watching a professional crisis manager." Captain Walsh approached the group. "Mr. Martinez, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen a civilian evacuation this well organized. What was your specialty in the military?" "Emergency operations and base security," Harold replied. "You learn to think systematically about moving people safely under pressure. Have you considered working with our department? We could use someone with your expertise for community emergency preparedness training." Harold looked around at his neighbors, people he'd lived near for 2 years but had never really gotten to know. Tonight had changed that. They'd worked together, helped each other, and proven that ordinary people could handle extraordinary situations when properly organized. "I'd be interested in helping with training," Harold said. "Though I should mention, I'm not much for publicity. I prefer working behind scenes." Young Jake Thompson shook his head. "Man, I've been living 2 floors down from you for a year, and I thought you were just some quiet old guy. Turns out you're like a secret emergency management expert." Harold smiled. "Not secret, just not something that comes up in everyday conversation." "Well, it's coming up now," said Sarah Kim. "Harold, would you be willing to help us organize a building emergency preparedness plan? Tonight proved we need better systems in place." Over the following hour, as residents waited for the all-clear to return to their apartments, Harold found himself answering questions about emergency preparedness, explaining evacuation procedures, and helping people understand what they'd done right and what could be improved. The most important thing, Harold told the gathered group, is that everyone stayed calm and helped their neighbors. You don't need military training to be good in a crisis. You just need to think before you act and look out for each other. The fire damage was contained to Mrs. Patterson's apartment and the unit directly above it. Thanks to the quick, organized evacuation, there were no serious injuries beyond smoke inhalation, and the Red Cross was able to arrange temporary housing for the displaced residents. As dawn broke and people began returning to their apartments, Harold was packing up the emergency supplies he'd organized when Captain Walsh approached him one more time. "Mr. Martinez, I meant what I said about training opportunities. The city has been looking for someone to head up a civilian emergency response program. Would you consider it?" Harold looked up at the building where his neighbors were now safely returning to their homes. For 2 years, he'd lived quietly, keeping to himself, enjoying retirement after decades of service. But tonight had reminded him of something important. Sometimes the skills you've learned in one part of your life. 3 weeks later, Harold Martinez became the Cedar Falls Community Emergency Response Coordinator, a part-time position that involved training civilian volunteers in disaster preparedness and emergency response protocols. His first class was held at Riverside Apartments, with most of his neighbors in attendance. As he explained basic evacuation procedures, emergency communication plans, and crisis decision-making, Harold realized that his military service hadn't ended when he retired. It had just found a new mission. The goal, Harold told his first class of volunteers, isn't to turn everyone into emergency professionals. It's to help ordinary people make good decisions under pressure and take care of each other when things go wrong. Sarah Kim raised her hand. "Harold, what made you so calm during the fire? The rest of us were panicking, but you seemed totally in control." Harold considered the question carefully. 25 years of military service teaches you that panic doesn't solve problems. Action does. But more importantly, it teaches you that taking care of people is the most important mission you can have. "In retirement," Harold replied, "you spend your whole career serving your country. When that's over, you find new ways to serve your community." As the weeks passed, Harold's emergency response training program expanded beyond Riverside Apartments to other buildings throughout Cedar Falls. The fire department reported improved evacuation times and better coordination during emergency responses in areas where Harold had conducted training. But for Harold, the most satisfying result was simpler. His neighbors had become friends, and his quiet retirement had become a meaningful continuation of his lifelong commitment to protecting others. The night of the fire had revealed not just Harold's hidden expertise, but the potential for ordinary people to take care of each other in extraordinary circumstances. And for a master sergeant who'd spent 25 years leading soldiers, guiding civilians to safety felt like the perfect final mission.